In this video, I'm going to be sharing with you how to set up linting and formatting in your Neovim config. I'm going to be using conform.nvim for formatting and nvim-lint for linting in this video. As many of you already know, nvim-lint, which is the plugin I had been previously using to do this, has been recently archived. This won't be a complete replacement for nvim-lint, as nvim-lint has some extra features to offer, but it still should work pretty well. I'll have a link in the description to my updated Neovim config with these changes applied, as well as to a blog post with all of the code you might need to follow along. Alright, with that said, let's get started. Alright, so I've opened up my Neovim config here. If you haven't seen my previous videos, this file you're looking at is the init.lua file, which is the primary file that Neovim looks at whenever it starts. The second line loads hosian.lazy, which corresponds to this lazy.lua file you'll see here on the left-hand side. I'm going to open this up. If you haven't used the lazy.nvim plugin manager before, I'd highly recommend you check out my video on everything you need to know to set this up. For a quick recap, these first 11 lines here bootstrap lazy so that when Neovim starts up, if lazy.nvim is not already installed, it'll get automatically installed. And then down here, I'm first loading the lazy.nvim plugin, and then I'm calling its setup function. And the first argument here is a table with two different folders that each contain plugin specs, so configurations for all of my different plugins. If I open up the File Explorer and I open up this plugins directory, and you'll see here a bunch of different files for different plugin configurations. And then I have this other LSP folder that has files for setting up and configuring LSP related plugins. In this video, I'm going to be swapping out nvim-lint, so I'm going to delete this nvim-lint file. I'm going to go ahead and do that here. I use the D command built into nvim tree to do this. And I'm going to open up this mason-null-ls file. In my previous video on setting up LSP for Neovim, I showed you guys how to put this file together. First thing here is the short plugin URL that tells lazy.nvim to install this plugin for us. Essentially, we use Mason to install language servers, but you can also use it to install linters and formatters, which we'll be needing for this setup. Now, if I open up the Mason UI by doing colon and Mason, you'll see here that if I press 2, you'll see a list of installed language servers, which I'm using in my setup. If I do 4, you'll also see a list of installed linters. And if you press 5, then you'll see a list of installed formatters and available formatters as well. I'm going to close this by pressing Q. Now down here, I'm also installing Mason LSP config, which makes it easier to automatically install language servers that we need. And I'm using mason-null-ls to automatically install linters and formatters that we needed for nvim-lint. In this config function, we set all of this up. We load Mason, and then we load Mason LSP config and mason-null-ls. Then down here in the setup function, I configure some icons for the Mason UI, and then in this Mason LSP config.setup, I use ensure installed and a list of language servers that I want Mason to automatically install whenever Neovim starts up. Now I do the same thing down here with mason-null-ls. You'll see here a list of ensure installed with formatters and linters that we want Mason to automatically install. But because I'm not going to be using null-ls anymore, I'm going to have to remove this. I'm going to remove these 9 lines and then go back up here, and I'm going to remove mason-null-ls and this import statement as well. And I'm going to save this file. Now I'm going to open up the lazy UI by doing colon lazy, and you'll see here under clean, lazy.nvim notices that we need to remove null-ls and mason-null-ls. To remove this, we can do uppercase X. Now to close this UI, I'm going to execute Q. And I'm going to open up the File Explorer. I'm going to close this LSP directory. I'm going to add a new file under plugins. I do this by pressing A, which is a built-in nvim tree command. And I'm going to call this formatting.lua and press enter. I'm going to open up this file and close the File Explorer. And I'm going to return a table here to set up the plugin spec for conform.nvim. The first thing we're going to need here is the short plugin URL for this plugin, which looks like this. And then I'm going to add an event property to lazy load this plugin on a specific set of Neovim events. This is because we don't really need formatting as soon as Neovim starts, but rather we need it when we're actually working inside of a buffer. So the first thing I'm going to add here is buff read pre. This essentially gets executed whenever we're opening an already existing file. And I also want to add buff new file, which will trigger when we're opening a buffer for a file that doesn't already exist. So whenever these two events trigger, the conform.nvim plugin will load. When this plugin loads, we want to run a config function. And the first thing I want to do here is load the conform plugin. After I require this plugin, I'm going to call its setup function like so. And inside of the setup function, we want to pass a Lua table. Inside of this table, we'll have a property called formatters by ft, which will be assigned to a Lua table. And inside, we'll specify file types. So for example, I'm going to add JavaScript here, and this is going to be equal to another table. And inside, I want to specify the name of a formatter that conform supports. So for JavaScript, I want to use prettier. I'm just going to put prettier in here. Alright, so I've opened up the conform.nvim repository so you guys can see a list of all of the different formatters that we have available. If I scroll down here, you'll see here a list of all of the different formatters we have available. For example, we have the prettier formatter, which we just configured for JavaScript. So if you're wondering what formatters you can use, you can take a look at this list and use the name that shows up here. Now, each of these formatters have a specific configuration. To see the configuration itself, we can go up here and you can go into this lua/conform folder and then open up this formatters folder. You can see examples of the configurations for all of the different formatters we have available. For example, for Python projects, you can check out black.lua, and this is the configuration for that specific formatter. You can also define your own custom configuration. If I go back up here to the home and go down here to the README, over here in this options section, you'll see that one of the properties in the setup function is this formatters property. And inside of here, you can define a custom formatter configuration where you define the command that will get executed to run the formatter and a bunch of other options that you can set up as well. I'm not using this feature, but just know that you can also set up a custom configuration for a formatter that isn't already supported by conform.nvim. And I also use prettier to format a bunch of other different types of files that are related for working on web development projects. So I'm going to go ahead and add those down here. I also want to add formatting for my Lua files. So down here, I'm going to add Lua is equal to style Lua, which is a formatter that is already supported by conform.nvim. And then for another example, I'm going to add Python. This is going to be equal to a table. And then I'm going to add two formatters for Python. I'm going to add isort to help with organizing Python imports. And I'm going to add black as well. How this works is that conform.nvim will execute isort first, and then it will execute black. If instead I were to do something like this and make this a subtable, what conform.nvim will do instead is choose the first available formatter out of the two. I don't want to do that, so I'm going to undo this. I'm going to save this file. Now I need to make sure that I've installed these formatters with Mason. So I'm going to open up the Mason UI with :mason. And you'll see here that I already have black, isort, prettier, and style Lua installed. If you're missing one, then you can go down here to available, hover over one, and then press I to install it. It'll get added to the installed list. I'm going to uninstall it by doing uppercase X. And then I'm going to close the Mason UI by doing Q. Now the next thing I want to do is set up formatting on save. Conform makes this really easy. We just need to add a new property down here. It's going to be called format on save. It's equal to a table. Down here, you can add some options. I'm going to add LSP fallback is equal to true. This means that if a formatter isn't available for the current file type, it'll try to fall back to formatting through the LSP. And then in the documentation, they also recommend to set async to false. This means that formatting won't be asynchronous, and because it won't be asynchronous, we'll specify a timeout in milliseconds, and I'm going to set this to 500. The default is 1000, which is 1 second. If you set async to true, then the timeout value will be ignored. I'm going to save this. Now the last thing I want to do here is to add a key map for formatting. So down here, I'm going to do vim.keymap.set, and then the first argument will be a table. Here we'll do N for normal mode and V for visual mode. And then I'm going to do leader MP for the key map. You can do whatever you like here. I'm doing leader MP, short for make pretty. And then I'm going to define a function that will execute whenever we trigger this key map. In this function, we'll do conform.format, and we'll pass some options to this. I'm going to do the same as before. So LSP underscore fallback is equal to true, async is equal to false, and timeout milliseconds is equal to 500. Now in normal mode, this key map will apply to the whole file, but because conform.nvim supports range formatting, in visual mode, the key map will apply formatting to whatever you have selected. The range formatting has been a bit hit or miss for me, and it can depend on whether or not your formatter supports it, but it's a feature that is available even though I don't use it as much. I'm also going to add a description to this. This will be format, file, or range, and the range will be in visual mode. And I'm going to save this. Now, so that we don't need to exit out of Neovim, I'm going to open up the lazy UI by doing :lazy. You'll see here that conform.nvim isn't installed, so I'm going to press capital I to install it. I'm going to press Q to close the UI, and then I'm going to do :lazy load conform.nvim so that we load this plugin and the config function runs. Now you'll see here that, for example, if I add some extra lines here and then I save this file, conform.nvim will automatically format it with this style formatter, which we've specified as the formatter for Lua files. These formatters should respect configuration files as well. I'm going to open up a new vertical split here and then open the file explorer. Down here, you'll see that I have a stylelua.toml file, which I use for configuring the formatting for my Lua config. I'm going to open this up and close the file explorer. Let's say, for example, that I change this indent width to 4 and I save this file. And then I go over here and I save it. I'm going to get the new indentation applied. I'm going to change this back to 2, save this file, go back here, and let's say I want to use my key map, I can do leader MP, and it'll run the formatter on the current file. I'm going to save this file now. For another example, I've opened up a React project here with TypeScript. I'm going to open up the prettier config file for this project. I'm going to do a split here, open the file explorer, and down here you'll see a .prettierrc file. I'm going to open this up. You'll see here that I set up single quotes to false, so everything is using double quotes by default. If I change this to true, save this file, move over here, and then select one of these lines with visual mode, and then apply the key map, leader MP, it'll apply the formatting only to that line, and that's the range formatting at work. If I do it without a selection and I do leader MP, it'll apply to the whole file. I'm going to change this back to false, and then I'm going to save this file. Alright you guys, now let's add linting to the config as well. I'm going to close this split and open the file explorer. Then I'm going to go up here to the plugins folder. I'm going to add a new file by pressing A, and I'm going to call this linting.lua. I'm going to open this up, close the file explorer, and then in here I'm going to return a table. The first thing we're going to add is the short plugin URL for nvim-lint. I'm going to add an event property here, and again this will have buff read pre and buff new file because we only need linting when we're working on a buffer. And then I'm going to add a config function. First thing I'll do here is load the plugin like so. And then to specify the file types where we want to use linting, we can do lint.lint linters underscore by underscore ft for file type, and this will be equal to a table, and then we'll list out all of the file types. So for example, again, I'm going to do JavaScript. This will be equal to another table, and I want to use ESLint underscore D as the linter for JavaScript files. As you can see, this is a very similar format to what we did with conform.nvim, and that's because the conform.nvim config and API is inspired by nvim-lint. Again, I've opened up the repository for nvim-lint, and in here you'll see a list of all of the different linters that you can use and are supported by default. Again, each of these will have a default configuration that is set up by nvim-lint. For example, we'll have one for ESLint underscore D, and if we want to use it, we'll have to use the name that you see here on the right hand side. If I go up here, and I go to Lua, lint, linters, and then in here again you'll have a list of all of the different configurations for our linters, and I click on, let's find ESLint, here it is, ESLint underscore D. I'm going to click on it, and then you'll see in here a table with all of the different properties that you can use to configure a linter with nvim-lint. This CMD property will define what needs to be executed for the linter to run. If I go back to the home and we take a look at the README, you'll see in the section for custom linters that you can define your own configuration with all of these different properties to set up a linter if it isn't already supported by nvim-lint. You probably won't need to do this as a lot of linters are already supported. If you want to customize a built-in linter, you can take a look at this section here, and you'll see that you have to load the linter and then modify one of its properties, like the args property, for example. Alright, so now I'm going to add the other file types I'm going to use ESLint with. Of course, this will vary depending on what type of projects you work on. And then I'm also going to add linting for Python. So I'm going to do Python is equal to pylint. There's several different linters you can use with Python. I don't work with Python very often. I just wanted to add another example for you guys, and I'm going to save this file. Again, you need to make sure that you've installed these linters through Mason. Some of the linters supported by nvim-lint might not be in Mason, and you'll have to install it in your system through another method. ESLint underscore D and pylint are both available through Mason. So if I open the Mason UI with :mason and I press 4, you'll see that I have ESLint underscore D and pylint already installed. Again, you can look for a linter you might be missing and you press I to install it. Once it's done, if you want to remove it, you can press capital X. I'm going to press Q to close this UI. Now the next thing we need to do is set up an auto command that will execute on different Neovim events and trigger linting. To do this, the first thing I want to do is to create an auto command group, which are used for grouping together auto commands in Neovim. I'm going to call this lint underscore group, and it's going to be equal to vim.api.nvim create nvim underscore create group. And then the first parameter is the name. I'm going to call this lint. And then I'm going to pass a table with options. I'm going to set clear to true so that when we get this auto command group, any pre-existing auto commands within it will get cleared. Now after defining the group, we can create the auto command. This will be vim.api.nvim underscore create auto cmd, and then the first parameter will be a list of Neovim events that we want to use to trigger linting. If you're wondering where to find a list of different Neovim events you can use, you can do :h events, and in here you'll see the help page with a list of all of the different Neovim events you can use. I'm going to close this. In here, the first event I'm going to use is buff enter. This means that whenever we open a new buffer or we move the cursor into it, it'll trigger linting. I also want to trigger linting after I write to a file, so I'm going to do buff write post. And I also want to trigger linting whenever I exit insert mode, so I'm going to do insert leave. Then I'm going to pass another table as an argument, and the group is going to be the lint group. And then we'll define a callback function that will execute whenever one of the events are triggered. In this function, we'll call lint.try-lint. So the lint plugin which we loaded will try to execute linting for the current buffer. And this will happen when we enter a buffer, when we write to the buffer, or we exit insert mode. You could even be more aggressive than this by adding something like text changed, but do note that some linters require the file to be saved before executing. So these insert leave and text changed events won't work with every linter. To check for this, you can again go to the repository, go to Lua, lint, linters, and let's open up ESLint_D. And you can check here if standard in is set to true or false. If it's set to true, then the file doesn't need to be saved for the linter to work. So with ESLint_D, we can run linting before saving to the file. But if I open up PyLint, so it's right here, I'm going to open that up, you'll see that standard in is set to false, and so PyLint will need you to save the file in order for the linting to work, so going out of insert mode or changing text won't work with this linter. You could add a pattern here and add a list of file types by doing something like star.ts and star.js so that the auto command only applies to certain file types, and you can define different events that you want to use for different files depending on the linter you're using. But for this case, I'm just going to define a single auto command, and I'm going to remove the pattern. I'm also going to remove the text changed event. So that linting runs a little less often, but it's still enough. I'm going to save this file, and the last thing I want to do is add a key map to trigger linting manually. I'm going to do vim.keymap.set. This will work in normal mode. The key map will be leader L, and it'll run a function. And in here we'll do lint.try_lint. I'll also add a description to it. This will trigger linting for current file. I define these descriptions for the which key plugin which I have added to my config, so that those of you that are using my config can get recommendations whenever you start typing out a key map. Now to show you an example, I've opened up a SpellKit project here, and this is a TypeScript file. This is the project I have for my blog. One rule I've configured with ESLint here is to prefer defining variables with const. So if I change this to a let, whenever I exit out of insert mode, the linting will fire, and I get this warning to use const instead. I'm going to open up the config file for ESLint. It's down here. You'll see that I have this rule for preferred const, and it's set to warn. If I turn this off and save this file, you'll see that I still have the warning on the left hand side, but whenever I move into it, which will trigger buff enter, it'll trigger linting and it'll go away. So if I move into it, I'm going to maximize this, you'll see that it goes away. I'm going to do that again. I'm going to change this to error, for example, save this file, move into the TypeScript file, and it'll trigger linting and show up as an error now. Again, linting will fire as we've configured it whenever we move into a buffer, exit out of insert mode, or write to the file. Now for another example with Python, you'll see that PyLint is giving me some errors. For example, this t1 variable, it's saying that it should be in snake case. So let's say I change this to snake case. You'll see that the error still shows up because PyLint needs me to save the file in order to rerun the linting. So if I save the file, now the linting error goes away. Before you finish, I want to point out that after putting all this together, I found a plugin for Mason that we can use to automatically install our linters and formatters whenever we start Neovim up as an alternative to mason-null-ls. I'm going to be including this in my config, which I'll have linked in the description. It'll look something like this, so I'm going to open up the File Explorer. I'm going to go over to LSP and Mason. I've added the plugin here. It's called Mason Tool Installer. I've set it up as a dependency for Mason. Down here, I'm loading it with a require statement. And then at the bottom, I'm calling its setup function, and I'm including an ensure installed list like you would do with mason-null-ls. And in here, I'm including the formatters, so prettier, stylua, isort, and black, as well as the linters, so pylint and eslint_d. This should be JavaScript linter. You might have noticed a different color scheme in my setup. I've been trying out something different here. Let's open up the File Explorer and go down to colorscheme.lua and open this up. You'll see that I've added Tokyo Night to my setup. I really like a lot of what the Tokyo Night color scheme supports, but I find it to be a little too purple for my liking. So I've made it a little more blue with these changes. I defined these variables here for some custom colors. And then I'm calling the Tokyo Night setup function. I'm using the night version of Tokyo Night. And then I'm changing some of these properties here with my custom colors to make changes to the color scheme. I've just been testing this out. It's not fully fleshed out or anything. I've been playing around with it. You can try it out if you like, but do note that there might be some colors that are a little off, as this is just something I've been experimenting with. I'm gonna be adding this to my config on GitHub, and I'm gonna leave this night flight GUI colors in case you want to keep using that. I might go back to it in the future. Alright you guys, so that is it for this video. I hope you found it interesting and helpful. If you did, don't forget to leave a like down below. Let me know in the comment section if you have any questions or feedback for me. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more content like this from me. See you guys in the next one. Peace.